Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, May 24th, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, designing your own brewing experiments. Say, for instance, you want to test for yourself which yeast gives you the best results, or you want to test the effects of different mash temperatures on attenuation rates. Well, Chris Colby from Brew Your Own magazine is going to join us to give us some direction on how best to design our experiments for the most accurate results. Well, if you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. Let's take a look into the mailbag and try to catch up on some listener mail, shall we? Brad from Appleton, Maine writes, I finally got around to listening to the podcast on oak and really enjoyed it. Well, thanks, Brad. Brad says, I have a 10-gallon oak barrel that I use exclusively for my ciders. Barrel aging imparts a nice complexity to my ciders and sizers, but the barrel does demand some attention. I chose not to go the sulfur route, so I never let the barrel dry out. When it doesn't have cider aging in it, I long-term store it with a solution of 2 ounces of sulfite, he says 100 Camden tablets, and 1 ounce citric acid in 10 gallons of water. That mix is good for around 2 months storage. Brad says for a treatment right before refilling with cider, I triple flush with fresh water, then use the same sulfite and citric acid mix in 2 gallons of water, which is sloshed around the barrel completely, and fresh water rinsed a final time. He says it works for me. So we appreciate that, Brad. Sounds like you can get a good workout, sloshing the stuff around in the little barrel as well. Rick Sellers from Pacific Brew News Radio has started a new brewing blog. You can check that out on pacificbrewnews.blogspot.com, and I'll put a link in this episode description on basicbrewing.com, basicbrewingradio.com. That's pacificbrewnews.blogspot.com. I'm sure Rick will keep that populated with all kinds of good information about great brews from the West Coast, and I'm sure that I'll be jealous when I'm reading it. Jealous of the good beers out there. Stephen from Virginia Beach, Virginia writes about his brand new Basic Brewing Go Forth and Flocculate t-shirt. Stephen says, I wore it while I was out shopping last night and got the strangest looks. One gentleman got up enough nerve to ask me, so what does flocculate mean? In a tone that hinted that he may have thought it was a dirty word. I explained the term to him, and we, of course, got onto the subject of home brewing. He wasn't aware that such a hobby was both legal or simple enough to do at home. Stephen says these shirts are a great way to spread the word. So there you go. Thanks, Stephen, for helping me to add that shameless plug in there in the middle of the mailbag. And thanks for supporting the podcast and helping to get the word out about us and about homebrewing in general. And you can find out more, by the way, about our Flocculate, Go Forth and Flocculate t-shirts at basicbrewing.com. And send us a picture for our little gallery. Chris from Oxford, Connecticut was the one who wrote in several episodes ago with the odd olive off flavor in his beer. Chris writes now with good news. He says, thank you to you and all your listeners for your feedback. I've contributed this, meaning the off flavor, to an infection. I changed out all my plastic buckets I use for fermenting. I also listened to your interview with the maker of Star San, that's Charlie Talley, and I have embraced the foam. I did not rinse with water. I just put my hopscotch wort into the foamy bucket and then into the foamy carboy, and have just tested it today, and it is perfect. Thank you. So tell all to embrace the foam. And Chris says, P.S., my fermentation started within 8 hours. I do think the foam did supply more food for the yeast. I think. Sounds like Chris needs to do an experiment. Well, that's great news. Congratulations, Chris. I appreciate the update. Glad we're able to get that martini olive flavor out of your beer there. We had another flurry of questions about Iota 4, And another flurry of answers from Merle Landman of National Chemicals, who was on the show a few episodes back talking about the proper use of iodophor. Kyle from the Woodlands, Texas, writes, one thing that immediately caught my attention was the swirling method you mentioned and promoted by the fellow from National Chemical. This might work for glass, but for plastics like PET or PET, better bottle, which are extremely hydrophobic, I'm not sure enough liquid remains on the surface of the carboy to sanitize. Kyle says, I've never been a swirler, but I have noticed that when I drain the sanitizer from the carboy and invert it to drain, there are only a few scattered droplets that remain on the interior surface of the carboy. Might this be a problem with the swirling method? Well, Merle Landman from National Chemicals writes, the sheeting action that happens with the iodophor is happening on the microscopic level, and you really have nothing to worry about the hydrophobic properties of the PET. However, if you are still concerned, you can do a two-step swirl. I guess that'd be a Texas two-step swirl. Swirl the iodophor solution, let it rest for a few seconds, and then do another swirl with the same iodophor solution. The kill rate with the iodophor is quite quick, with the majority of the kill happening in the first 10 to 12 seconds. By introducing another swirl, you get the sea of iodophor reintroduced to the surface, providing another kill session. You can then dump the solution and let the container drip dry. So there you go. The Texas two-step for Kyle down there in Texas. Kevin from Saginaw, Michigan writes, is there an easy way using the cap from the bottle of iodophor to measure the proper amount for sanitizing? And Merle answers, some of our packaging references cap quantities in the directions, but really only as a last-case scenario. While we attempt to stay with static packaging, this is not always possible. Even caps from the same manufacturer can be cut from different molds with tolerable variations for use as a cap, but when you deal with a product like iodophor, where 1/10 of an ounce prepares 1 gallon of solution, those variations can have a measurable impact. In short, Merle says if you have no other option, use the cap reference on the package, if there is one. Otherwise, stick to the apothecary cup, or use a graduated cylinder. Merle says if you're looking for a more household method of measuring, 1.5 U.S. teaspoons or 0.5 U.S. tablespoons will give you 0.25 U.S. fluid ounces, which will prepare 2.5 gallons of solution. So once again, 1.5 U.S. teaspoons for 2.5 gallons of solution. And Merle says you can extrapolate that to 5 U.S. teaspoons or 1 U.S. tablespoon to prepare 5 gallons of solution. So that seems easy enough. On the topic of sanitization, Thomas from Denmark wrote in after hearing our conical show last week. Thomas says, I listen to your show every week. I appreciate that. And I really enjoy it. Appreciate that. I heard your show about conical fermenters, and I think you missed one thing. Sanitization. Well, you're right. I forwarded the question to Mark Smith, who is one of the conical owners featured on the show, and Mark says, I sanitize my conical first by pouring in 5 gallons of iodophor solution. I open and close both ball valves 5 or 6 times to allow the solution into the valves. Then, with the iodophor solution still in the conical, I spray down the exposed sides with Star San solution in a spray bottle. I also hit the lid with Star San. I allow to drain and then assemble the conical to receive the wort. Mark says you could also use iodophor solution in a spray bottle if you like. If you listen to the sanitization shows, it just has to remain wet for 2 minutes to achieve sanitary condition. I like Star San, Mark says, because it lasts longer in the spray bottle, and I also like the foaming action. So Mark is embracing the foam. Lars from Boston writes about another detail we missed last week. Lars writes, neat show on the conicals. Now I want one too. Or great show on the... I cut off his G. Sorry about that, Lars. Great show on the conicals. Now I want one too. Thinking through the process, how do you go about aerating the wort after brewing? So we missed that too. So thanks, Lars. Here's Mark's reply. He says, oh yeah, add another $40 for an aeration system, either an aquarium pump pumping sanitized air or an oxygenation system. This is really the only way I know to get the oxygen into the wort using a conical. The conical is too big and awkward to shake, and it could damage the legs during the process. With an air pump, let it run for about an hour if you can. Mark says foaming can be a problem. And with oxygen, let it run 2 to 3 minutes and you're done. I've also seen some things, this is me talking now, I've also seen some things in either BYO or Zymergy about how to build an inline aeration system where you can aerate your wort as it's going into the conical using an air stone. So check that out. And one final one from Barry, and I don't know where Barry is. Barry says, on your last podcast, the point of cleaning a valve fitting came up. After fighting this issue for several brewing sessions, the discussion grabbed my ear. Despite most overly protective manufacturers suggesting obsessive maintenance schedules, regularly cleaning the valve fitting is an important recommendation you should not skip. Barry says, I ferment out of a converted keg with a weldless valve. Among the places that wild yeasts and bacteria can find a home in the valve that you don't touch with a standard cleaning is in the inner wall between the washer and the inside body, within the threads on the inside, on the surface of the ball exposed in the closed position, in the tunnel of the ball exposed in the open position, on the surface of the valve body containing the surface of the ball in the open position. Barry says if you don't take it apart regularly for cleaning, it's my Tom, but somebody requested more Tom Brokaw, so when I misspeak, I'll just blame it on doing a Tom Brokaw impression. Not that Tom Brokaw misspeaks. I have great respect for Tom Brokaw. Just has a little thing going on. Anyway, if you don't take it apart regularly for cleaning, every time you open the valve to check your gravity, you're exposing your beer to risk. Barry says, it's a pain, but I now take the assembly apart every other brew session and have a supply of rubber O-rings for gasket replacement if needed. And Mark says, very good advice. I know I should take apart the 3-piece ball valve after each and every use, but like I said in the podcast, I simply don't have the time. However, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And Mark says, I think every other time is a good rule of thumb. So, Mark Smith hears from a brewer with even more strict procedures than himself. Can you believe it? Just kidding. Teasing you, Mark. Mark did explain to Barry his practice of running his sanitizer through the valve while opening and closing it several times. So I've said before, it's all in what makes you happy and comfortable, and if you're making good beer, if you're getting good beer that you like, then you're doing good things. Of course, we could always do better, I'm sure, but anyway. Now, that's a lot of mail. Appreciate all that. You can, if you're wanting to send comments or questions or what have you, send them to james@basicbrewing.com or just use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from, Barry. Now, let's go on with this week's interview. In the upcoming issue of Brew Your Own magazine, editor Chris Colby shows us how to design our own brewing experiments. And I asked him to come on the show to walk us through the process. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks for having me, James.
We're going to talk about getting experimental today. And, I guess, first of all, let's start out like you did in your article and talk about the state of knowledge in home brewing today. Where are we?
Right. Well, information, these days, homebrewers have access to a wide variety of information. And it comes from a lot of different sources. We have, for one thing, the long history of brewing. People have been brewing for centuries, and more recently the sort of modern English brewing tradition, the modern German, and even the Belgian stuff. We've got quite a bit of info just from how they do their brewing. And a lot of that, of course, brewing developed in a pre-scientific era. So a lot of what the various brewing traditions do, must have been found basically by trial and error, and probably the occasional brewer who sort of took a calculated guess or whatever. More recently, there's been the field of brewing science that's developed, and people have gone about studying brewing scientifically. In England and in Germany, there are, and in Belgium, there are places that study beer scientifically. And in the United States, of course, brewing is a multi-gazillion-dollar industry, and the amount of money they've put in studying American Pilsners is just huge. And all this information from both history and from the science that's developed around the commercial brewing has sort of filtered into the homebrewing community. And so we've got that, which is a relatively good footing. But we've also got just a sort of homebrewing. There's just a lot of random ideas or half-baked ideas that people have tried something and they sort of liked it and they tell a couple people, and suddenly something goes from a sort of an experiment into almost like common wisdom that this works, without sort of skipping the step of proving that it actually works. And that's the sort of setup for my article, which then gets to, well, how do you prove that something works, or how do you test a hypothesis?
So there's not much corporate money being put into brewing on a 10-gallon scale or a 5-gallon scale?
No. Any brewing science study is going to be funded by people who are interested in commercial brewing, and nobody is studying brewing at the scale we do. And home brewers, a lot of the commercial stuff has a direct applicability to us. We still mash our grains, we boil our worts, we cool it, ferment it, and those sort of things are applicable. But the scale we do it on, and the improvised equipment that we do it on, and just recently with the craft brewing boom, and just sort of the ingenuity and experimental nature of homebrewers, and just all the new different kind of techniques you can do. None of these have been studied scientifically, or even quasi-scientifically. And you can think of any number of things from people have come up with different ways of sparging, no sparge and batch sparging, and different ways of hopping, including adding all your hops right at the end, or adding hops before you even start to boil, first wort hopping. And some of these have been done at a commercial level too. But there's just a lot of techniques that we do or adapt or try at a homebrew level, and opinions sort of start to congeal about them after a while. But for the most part, they're never really put to a direct test.
I guess part of the beauty of brewing on such a small scale is that we can afford to play around. We can afford to experiment.
Yeah, if you're interested in it, it's not that hard. It does to really make a good experiment. It does take a little work. You're going to have to be brewing a few batches of beer. You're going to have to be paying close attention to what you're doing when you do it. But it's certainly not, it's certainly within the realm of any individual homebrewer, and certainly well within the realm of any homebrew club to pick, a pertinent homebrew science question and answer it with a good experiment.
We've done some experimentations. When I say we, I mean our listeners have done some experimentations with some stuff. And the things that come to mind are the hot side aeration experiment that Brian Warren and John Holder did, and you took part in a phase of that. And then Michael Tonsmeyer with his Belgian candy sugar experiment, and also his American hop experiment. And those were very enlightening. We found out. What are some of the myths or some of the topics out there that you would like to see experimentation on?
Oh, wow. There's just, I don't know, there's just a billion out there. Going back to your old homebrew books, there's there's sort of things that don't make sense. Like a lot of people swear that if you prime a 5-gallon batch of beer that you're bottling, you use one amount of sugar to get the right carbonation level, but if you do it in a keg, you use much less. And that seems kind of weird. There's the old chestnut of if you force carbonate a keg, it has a coarser, bigger bubbles than if you prime it with sugar and let it naturally carbonate. And I mean that's one that people argue back and forth on. And some people say, well, it takes a while to naturally carbonate the beer, whereas when you force carbonate it, you're drinking it the next day. And so you don't give it. But you could do 2 kegs, or better yet, do 4 kegs, and let them sit side by side. Force carbonate 2, naturally carbonate 2. Let them sit for the same amount of time, and then try it. And you can answer that experiment. There's also the old thing about the less level you put in your bottles, the more carbonated it'll get. And then other people say, no, you've just got a bigger, sort of echo chamber when you open it, and there's that much headspace that, if you fill it higher, it should be, for one thing, you've got more sugar in there, unless you primed each bottle individually. And, there's an endless amount of ones. There's one about batch sparging that supposedly it leads to more malty beer but less astringent, which is kind of odd when you think about it. I mean, they frame it in terms of the pH, but malt flavors and astringency both come from the husks, so somehow they're saying that batch sparging takes more of the good stuff out of the husks but less of the bad stuff. And it's like, okay, it'd be nice to see someone test that into, the answer that some people come up to that is that, well, you get a lower efficiency batch sparging, so you pull less overall stuff out of the husks, so it seems less, seems and is less astringent, but it's not really more malty. It's just, but then again, that's not proven either. That's just that's why you test things.
Yeah,
there's just so many things in the homebrew community right now that people swear up and down, usually based on either they've heard it somewhere or maybe they've tried it once, but not in a side by side comparison. And it would just be nice to sort of mobilize some of the more the homebrewers with a little bit more of a scientific bent and start testing some of these questions, because I bet we'd find some interesting results, and I bet it would lead to sort of new techniques, new ways of doing things that people haven't thought about.
Well, I found that if I wave a chicken bone over my fermenter, it really improves the taste of my beer. So that's in my experience, that's what I've found.
When it's raining out, I make really good beer for some reason. I don't know why that is. I haven't figured out the causal effect there, but every beer that's done really well at the National Homebrewing contest, when I send it in, when I go back and look in my notebook, I've noted in there that it rained that day. So.
And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you will only brew when it's raining.
Yeah, I start looking at the weather, and on a day that it's not raining, if I make a mistake, I'm just like, screw it, whatever. Days when it's raining, I'm very careful because I know that this could be the one.
So how do we go about proving our hypotheses, or even coming up with our hypotheses? What's the example that you used in the article?
In the article, I stuck with a very simple experiment, a very simple thing that someone might want to test, and that's, let's say you had 2 strains of yeast that supposedly were for use in making the same kind of beer. How would you test to see which one was better, or if they were distinguishable at all? And this is a fairly good question, because a lot of people, both White Labs and Wyeast, and there's also dried yeast companies, put out yeast strains, and it's sort of widely known that some are the same strain, and you often hear some people saying well, I like White Labs 001 because Wyeast 1056 gives me a different flavor, and other people say no, they're the same strain, they're blah blah blah. So that's a reasonable test. Are 2 strains that are supposedly the same thing from 2 different companies, are they distinguishable? from one another. And in the article, I set up, sort of a hypothetical, two home brewers who are out to test two strains of yeast. In the article, I make it in an alternate world where they have two companies called Black Labs and Z Yeast instead of White Labs and Y Yeast, so they didn't get mad at me. And so these two homebrewers set out to test two strains of a kind of yeast that's supposed to make a Norwegian-style ale in the story. And basically what I do is I try to take people through a series of bad experiments, a series of, some of them aren't even really experiments, but, ways that people might try to gain knowledge between these two, but be led astray just because it's not a good experiment. And I start out with the first one is, let's say someone just goes and tries one of the kinds of yeast, tastes the beer and likes it. Okay, he might say, this strain is obviously better than the other one. But, of course, that's a really horrendously bad test of the question because he hasn't even tried the other one. You've just, picked something, liked it, and stuck with it. And, people are sort of almost programmed to do that. A lot of people drink, Coke versus Pepsi simply because when they grew up they drank Coke versus Pepsi, or that happened to be the first one they tried. So, people are sort of prone to, if you try something and you like it, you automatically sort of assume that the other option isn't as good. But of course, that's not a scientific test.
So in the same way that the Pepsi challenge actually opened some people's eyes back in the 70s, doing a side-by-side taste test is the first step maybe in starting your experiment.
Yeah, you want to, at a bare minimum, you want to be comparing the two things and actually have some experience with them. How exactly you do that, though, is worthwhile to look into. I mean, in my example, in my article, I give the example that one of the homebrewers, Ole, brews a traditional Norwegian ale with the one strain, and his friend Sven brews sort of a Christmas Norwegian ale with the other. And they compare those two. And, in that case, you are comparing, a beer made with that yeast and a beer made with the other. But there's also a ton of other variables thrown in that one. There's, the fact that there are two different brewers. There's two different recipes. There's, if they lived in different towns, they're using two different water supplies. And, you're really, if you compare two different, experiments or experimental trials, but there's many, many differences between the two besides the variable you're looking at, you really can't make a good, you really don't get a good test of your hypothesis there. It could be if you like, in the example I just gave, it could be if you like one beer versus the other, you just like the recipe of one versus the other. It could be that one guy's just a better brewer than the other. It could be that, one person lives somewhere where they have a really nice, potable, good water supply, and the other person lives somewhere where the water's just terrible. There's any number of things.
And the brewing setup, the equipment, the strength of the boil, everything.
Yeah.
So in an ideal universe, if you're doing an experiment, you want to limit your variable that you're testing down to one.
Yeah, if you're testing, one variable question like this, it's just the yeast strain. You want everything in your experiment to be the same, with the exception of the yeast. Conceptually, that's a really easy idea. In practice, it gets a little bit harder to make, everything exactly the same between two batches. But one thing you can do in a lot of different kind of homebrew things that really sort of levels the playing field is do a split batch. Like, as you well know, because you've done it on your homebrewing show, you can make like one batch of wort or one batch of mead, split it into several different fermenters, and, if you're testing yeast, that's an easy test because you've got wort that's the same. Hopefully you've moved it into fermenters that are the same. Hopefully you've aerated, the same, which that can be problematic. And then you can just, try, in a two test or in a, two yeast strain test, you could try, the one strain in one fermenter and the one strain in the other. And there you get a direct test. You've got the same wort. Maybe the aeration differed. Maybe, you never know. Even if you try hard, maybe one of the fermenters got a little bit warmer than the other. But at least by doing a split, a split wort, you've leveled the playing field a little bit. And you can also do things like if you wanted to try two different hops in a boil, you can do a split mash. You could collect your entire wort and then split it between two, brew kettles that hopefully they'd be, the same shape, composition, and hopefully you'd heat the worts the same. And but you can do a lot of things where you split a batch.
So if you do your best to limit your experiment to changing only one variable, you still can't be confident of your results yet, right? You've got to be able to repeat the experiment to get reliable results.
An experiment where you do essentially, one single experimental group, where you do sort of like in our experiment, let's say you do, you split the wort into two carboys and you pitch one with one yeast and one with the other. If you find a difference between those two, even if you've been very, very careful and tried to make everything the same, it's still always possible that there's some sort of fluke that you didn't account for. Maybe one of the carboys wasn't cleaned quite as well as the other, and it got a small amount of contamination that soured the beer just slightly, or maybe even less than you could detect. Maybe one of the carboys got a little bit hotter than the other. Maybe where you put it, the sunlight came through a window and shone on one of the carboys for a couple minutes. You just don't know. And the way you get around that is that, although the results of comparing, say, two carboys, one to the other, could be a fluke, when you start getting a bigger sample size, the odds of things being a fluke become less and less. For example, if you did 4 carboys, 2 with one kind of yeast and 2 with the other, you've essentially repeated the experiment once. And you can, if you've got the result that the 2 pitched with the one yeast taste the same, the 2 pitched taste, with the other tasted the same, but there was a difference between the 2, then you've got a pretty good, a fairly good experiment there. You've, limited your variables, to the extent that, basically the experimental variable is the only one that varies, and you've replicated the experiment once, showing that you could, repeatedly show this. If the differences between the two strains were really subtle, and there was, some variance showing like maybe both of the first ones, seemed kind of similar, but they, that you could tell a difference between them, and same with the others, and it looked like there might have been a little area of overlap in the middle, you might have to do, many, If it's a very subtle difference, you might have to do 10 carboys of one and 10 carboys of the other, and then you'd also need to actually use statistics to help tease out the differences. But hopefully, at least in the first round of things you would study as a home brewer, you would pick things that are going to have a big enough difference that you really don't need to rely on statistics to start pulling out the differences, but that you would a reasonably well constructed small experiment that has, some level of replication could show, strongly the result.
Our hot side aeration experiment, or John and Brian's hot side aeration experiment, was a perfect example because one of the 4 bottles being tested had an infection, or one of the 4 batches, one of the fermenters, I guess, because it carried on into the second round of bottles. So they were able to trace it back to an infection happening in the fermenter. So in that case, it would have been good to have another set of fermenters with the same worts in them so that you could kind of double up on your experiment size and cut down on your risk of a mistake happening.
Right. The reason for replication are there's a couple. Is that one is that you want to show that, if you're saying, let's say you've got 2 yeasts and you say one attenuates better than the other, you want to show that the results of like a single trial where you've tested one carboy versus one carboy aren't just a fluke. You want to show that if strain 1 attenuated, 3 points better than the other one, in your first trial, you want to show that it repeatably does that. And second, the more different experimental groups you do, the bigger your sample size, the less that little flukes, and they happen all the time, even if you're careful. The less that a single fluke is going to throw off your whole experiment. Because if let's say you did 6 carboys 3 by 3, and the first 3 that you pitched with yeast number 1 all tasted the same, but let's say 2 of the ones you pitched with number 2 tasted the same but different from number 1, and then the third one tasted sour, you'd still have an experiment left. You'd say, well, we're gonna, that's clearly sour. That's not a normal outcome of strain number 2. And if you could show that it's contaminated, you could then throw that data point out.
You also have to contend with the fact that we are human beings, and we may unconsciously affect the results of the experiment by our own biases, right?
Yeah, I go into that a little bit in the article, and I don't know if that's going to make the final version, but yeah, I talk about it a little in the version I sent you, and that because in my example, one of the homebrewers is very brand loyal to Black Labs, and in the story, his wife points out that, well, if you're doing the experiment and you're judging the experiment, and we already know that you've got a preference ahead of time, that could skew the results. And so I talk a little bit about blind experimentation. And in the story, it turns out that his friend then makes the yeast starters for him. Then he brews the beers and pitches the yeast. Because given that his friend made the starters, and labels them, in some sort of code, 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, or whatever, when he has the yeast starts, he doesn't know which is which, so he can't, aerate his favorite, yeast brand a little bit more or treat the carboys a little bit better. And then we also talked about judging, or I also talked about judging in the article, and, homebrew contests are sort of a good way to get, a blind trial of your beer. There's some good points and bad points about that. You can't if you're testing, say, the diacetyl level in something, you can't send it to a homebrew contest and say, would you guys compare diacetyl levels? Because it's just going to get judged on whether the judges like the beer or not. But, you could certainly judge the scores. You could look at the comments and, getting, some other people to test your beer. You can also, one thing I've done on some sort of mini experiments is just bring the bottles to my homebrew club and give them to people and try them, and then after they've tried them, then reveal this one's this yeast, this one's this other yeast, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you might not even tell them what you're sampling for, what you're testing for.
Right. It sort of depends on. Sometimes you might, if you want them, that's the variable to focus on. Sometimes you might want not. You might want to see if they, if you're studying, say, acetaldehyde levels, and you think one of them has a level of acetaldehyde that's just too high, you might not point that out just to see if anyone, blindly pulls that up and says, oh yeah, that's got a lot of acetaldehyde in it. It all depends on. I mean, one point I make in the article is that most scientific experiments are not carried out blind. The researcher knows what his variables are. He knows, because he's labeled all his, whether they be test tubes or fermenters or, whatever, and then he judges the experiment on his own. And, most of the time if you're doing a homebrew experiment, that's going to be the case. But given that a big part of homebrewing is subjective, flavor and do you like this, don't you like this, having some avenues like homebrew contests, homebrew clubs, or just, a friend that has a good palate, if you can just, tap them and say, try these 2 beers and tell me what you think. That's a good way to get, a blind element of testing into your homebrew experiment.
But not every test would require you to have subjective results. You can have objective results. You can have stuff can be measured by hard data. For instance, if you're testing the attenuation levels of yeast at different fermentation temperatures or something like that, that's something that you can measure with equipment and not your taste buds.
Right. One thing obviously about beer is that, it's primarily made to taste good and stuff. So a lot of the tests we do are going to have some component of tasting, and some of it's going to be subjective. But there are a lot of hard variables we can measure. Some examples I give in the story are if you're testing two yeast strains. One thing you can do is if you pitch the same amount of yeast, and you're fermenting at the same oxygenation levels and same temperature, you can record, like, when do the two strains start fermenting? Is one a faster starter than the other? You could then also write down when do they stop fermenting. Does one keep chugging along hard, or does it slow down? Some yeasts go quick at the beginning and then slow down. You could, if you really wanted to, pull a little sample every day and record the progress of the gravity drop. You can test the final gravity that they reach. You can test the pH at the end, or if you were really ambitious, throughout the entire fermentation. You can test things like pour two beers into two identical glasses and see actually measure with a ruler how high the head goes. That's what you got to be careful to pour really exactly the same for both of them. But again, if you try lots and lots of trials, that should even out any little errors. And there are a lot of things that if you're doing a good homebrew experiment, although tasting it is in almost all cases going to be a big part of it, the more data you can get, the more hard data, that you've measured something with a piece of equipment that's not, subject to, at least too much interpretation. You can read a hydrometer, about a point high or low if you're, looking at it wrong, but, a pH meter is going to, especially a digital meter of any kind or digital thermometer, you can't really misread that. So, definitely try to get whatever hard data you can. Even if one thing, when I do a homebrew experiment, I try to gather data on everything I could, even if the hypothesis is, fairly narrowly focused that I'm testing. As long as you're going through the hassle of doing the whole experiment, why not take notes sort of broadly and try to figure it out? Like if you're doing, as I am right now, an experiment on color with crystal malts, I'm still going to be taking a look at things like head retention, attenuation, just a wide variety of things, just because if I'm going to go through the, hassle of making, like, I don't know how many batches I'm going to make for this, between 8 and 12, maybe I'll find something just randomly by looking at the other data.
And you never know where the explanation for the experiment's going to hide. It could be in the temperature of your fermentation. It could be in the amount of yeast that you pitch. All these things, especially, it's just good in brewing in general. If you want to duplicate a good beer that you've brewed, if you don't know all the variables, you can't go back and try to replicate it.
Sure, because having different conditions for the experiment could lead to completely different results. Like, let's say you're testing two wheat beer strains and you're trying to determine which is more clovey than the other. The difference is, one might be more clovey if you ferment them both in the low end of the range, and the other might be more clovey if you ferment it at the high end of the range. So you can't. There's a potential for, the results of this experiment to change when the conditions do. You might be testing two ale strains and say one of your criteria might be, how estery fruity does it taste, and that might vary with oxygen level, to the point that one might produce fairly low esters at low, oxygenation, but it might stay that way as, oxygenation increased. The other might produce, say, quite a bit of, fruity esters at low oxygenation levels, but it might, purely hypothetically, it might, decrease greatly as oxygenation levels increased. So, like, which one is fruitier would be dependent on oxygenation levels. The two, lines might cross at some point. So, you always want to take, as much data as you can during an experiment. Every home brewer has at least a thermometer and a hydrometer. And, in addition to that, a lot of people have a pH meter. There's a lot of things you can just measure, that you don't really need fancy equipment. You can measure the headstand on something with just a ruler.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of opportunities to get actual, hard data. Everyone should have a clock or a stopwatch at home, or a calendar if you're determining how long it takes to ferment something out. And so there's definitely casting a bigger net with the the amount of data you collect in an experiment is always a good thing. Even if you're really focused on one aspect and you're just looking at, say, diacetyl level, or maybe you're looking at taking a series of beers where you've used like no Irish moss in one, half a teaspoon in another, 1 teaspoon, 1.5, a series like that. You might be thinking the only thing you're going to be looking at is, cloudiness, but you should take a look at other things. The headstand, the time of fermentation, the final gravity. Maybe and this is just random like speculation, but maybe at high enough levels, maybe Irish moss pulls out enough things from the wort that it actually makes the yeast have to work harder, or something like that. There's a million different variables in home brewing, and they're all interconnected, and they don't always work out like how we might be thinking they are. So when conducting an experiment, it's best to try to keep an open mind, try to take as many measurements as you can, and of course write them all down too, so that you don't forget them.
And the article ends with your soliciting experiments from readers. So you're wanting people to go out there and get busy and report back to you and expand the homebrewing knowledge out there.
Yeah, one thing, this next year I've got a couple experiments that I'm going to be running at home, and there's actually a lot of opportunity for little ones. But yeah, I am looking for people who in addition to brewing a couple batches of beer, might want to do an experiment, and hopefully they'll write me, and we can discuss the experimental method, so that hopefully we can design an experiment that will actually has a chance of answering the question that we're posing. And it'd be great. I'd love to. That's one thing I'd really like to do in the future, is have experiments show up, homebrew experiments, how to brew beer on a homebrew scale, and experiments relating to the things that homebrewers do that show some kind of result.
Well, all right, very good. And there's also another article in the magazine by somebody else that we know.
By some guy named James Spencer.
Yeah.
Never heard of him.
A small-minded guy talking about small batches.
Run some little podcast or something.
a well-edited piece in the magazine, so look out for that as well.
Yeah, I think that turned out. It turned out well. Just an explanation of sort of what are the benefits of brewing at a smaller scale. Why might you want to do that, and if you do, a few of the things that might make your brewing experiences more pleasurable.
And you're also running an article on what it's like to brew in a small environment.
Yeah, actually, that got cut.
Oh.
Yeah. There was going to be a sidebar to your article on that, but that got cut. No space.
That's kind of ironic that the article about limited space got cut because
because of limited
space. Yeah. Well, maybe next time. Well, all right, Chris. We appreciate your help again, and we look forward to the experiments that we will see flooding forth in the pages of BYO in the months to come.
Yeah, hopefully. Probably not in the months to come, but after a few months, hopefully we got a couple rounded up, and I'm excited too. I think there's always the potential for a few myths to get busted, and there's always sometimes also just confirming something that's widely held can be a good thing too. If people have always said that use this technique because it's better than the other, and it's never been proven. If someone can do that, then it's good because you can go, okay, that really is better than that, and then you can go about, figuring out why.
Well, I appreciate your time, Chris.
Okay, thanks for talking to me, James.
Well, thanks again to Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine. If you click on the Brew Your Own banner on basicbrewing.com, you can get a free issue of the magazine. And if you subscribe after that, you'll be supporting this podcast. And you can read the article that I wrote on small batch brewing. And I appreciate the Basic Brewing Radio listeners who helped to contribute to that piece. And I appreciate Chris's help in editing that piece. He had some good contributions to that as well. Now, one more episode before vacation next week. One more episode, and after next week, I'm planning on taking the month of June off, just slap off. Thanks to family vacation and the National Homebrewers Conference and other stuff that's going on. It was going to be hard to stay on schedule, so I decided to just give in and take some time off. And the good news is that when we get back, we'll have lots of stuff from the Homebrewers Conference in Denver. And, by the way, we will be marking the 100th episode when we get back. So I think we deserve a little time off. Oh, there's plenty of stuff in the archives to listen to if you miss us. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us online. And I'll pack it up myself. And thanks again to everybody who's doing the T-shirts as well. Still getting orders for our Go Forth and Flocculate T-shirt, the conversation starter mentioned in the front of the show. Also, thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link, and I just realized I forgot to look up the two little products, the featured products. So, shame on me. I need a vacation. Maybe I'll do 4 next week or something, or maybe not. If you click on that Amazon.com link and do some Amazon shopping on Amazon.com, we'll get a little slice of that action, and you don't have to pay anymore. So, anyway, need more coffee. Thanks again, everybody. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson down in Austin, who also did our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.